The final chapter on JFK, Chapter 10, Segment 3, Turbulence.
With Air Force One heading back to Washington, D.C., carrying the new president in his entourage and the dead president with his widow and part of his entourage, you would think that things would be at least calm for the flight. And according to some historians, it was. But three things actually happened on that flight of great significance. All were covered up, but over time they have seeped out and come to the surface. It was a turbulent flight. The flight from Love Field in Dallas, Texas, to Andrews Air Force Base outside of Washington, D.C. was only 2 hours and 13 minutes. On the ground, at the time the plane was in the air, CIA Director John McCone, JFK's appointee to that position, raced over to Robert Kennedy's farm in Virginia to console him, and the men stayed together for over 3 hours. McCone, with Robert F. Kennedy as the head, was involved in Operation Mongoose as designated by John F. Kennedy. And Operation Mongoose was to kill Fidel Castro. Now, it is doubtful that during the 3 hours the men talked a lot about Operation Mongoose because nothing had come to successful fruition in the killing of Fidel Castro. But it is clear that after this meeting, with Lyndon Johnson in power, John McCone, as a CIA director, was required to serve a new master. The new president, Lyndon Baines Johnson. He reported to Johnson alone. He took orders from Johnson alone. It is doubtful from the time that those men ended that meeting that McCone ever shared any information with Robert Kennedy about what he knew relating to Robert Kennedy's brother, John F. Kennedy. In fact, within hours of that meeting, the photographs and information relating to Lee Harvey Oswald's imposter in Mexico City had already been transported from the CIA offices in Mexico City to Dallas, and then being forwarded on to the CIA headquarters in Washington, D.C. The fact that the CIA evidence about Lee Harvey Oswald's imposter had been buried for more than 35 years is proof that someone ordered McCone and the CIA to bury that evidence. And that person had to have been Lyndon Baines Johnson, because Johnson, the CIA, and the FBI knew about this within 24 hours of Kennedy's death. Now, with that occurring on the ground, there were other, even more interesting matters occurring with the plane in the air. The first is someone on Air Force One was inquiring about the major crime scene, the limo. They're carrying Kennedy's body back, and there are questions and inquiries as to where the C-130 cargo plane is carrying the crime scene. And when this information was relayed to the plane, one of the pilots asked, "Who wants this information?" And as a further transmission shows, he realizes who wanted that information and says he knows and will pass it on. Why would Lyndon Johnson want to know where the crime scene is? And more importantly, could the Soviet Union, could Castro, could the CIA, could the military-industrial complex, could South Vietnam, could any other government, entity, company, person have acquired and marshaled all of the evidence from Parkland Memorial Hospital and have it brought back to Washington, D.C., except for Lyndon Johnson? Now, why would Johnson want to know where the limo was as he was in the air? But with that said, more immediate concerns were relating to Kennedy's body. And as the records show from airplane to ground transmissions, Kennedy's body was originally scheduled and should have gone and been autopsied at Walter Reed Medical Center. It was one of the world's best hospitals for treatment for gunshot wounds, seeing thousands upon thousands every year, and they had the skill not only to treat it, but to evaluate gunshot wounds. Yet, it was changed in midair to Bethesda, where there were untrained physicians with no forensic pathology skills at all, waiting to conduct an autopsy. Interestingly enough, if we look at the transmission tapes, the call is for a standard military autopsy. The third critical event that occurred on Air Force One as it was returning to Washington, D.C., related to some of John F. Kennedy's aides on the plane already accusing Lyndon Baines Johnson of being involved in Kennedy's death. And this became heated. Now, this doesn't show up in any ground to plane or plane to ground transmissions because it was happening on the plane. And Johnson certainly wouldn't agree to it, nor would his aides. But yet, it's true and it happened. And the reason we know it happened is because after Kennedy's death, the Kennedy family hired a famous writer by the name of William Manchester to write the account of President Kennedy's death. Manchester received this information from a number of sources who were on the plane that day and who witnessed the event. And Manchester put it in his drafts of his book, The Death of a President. And before release, when the Kennedy family read about those events, they demanded that Manchester remove those facts. Manchester refused. And as a result, the Kennedys sued the man they hired to write the book, The Death of a President. Now, why? It could be because at the time they didn't have substantial proof. It could be that they did not want to harm the United States government as an institution, especially the presidency. It could be they did not want to harm Bobby Kennedy or Teddy Kennedy's career. It could be they did not want to harm the Democrat Party. It is not known why they did it, but they achieved what they started their lawsuit for. Manchester did remove those facts from the book, but in settlement of the case, he was allowed to put in a notation at the front of the book stating that various events were removed from the book, but they were not of historical significance. This, of course, begs the question, if Kennedy's aides were already accusing Johnson of being involved in his death as a right-hand man, why would this not be of historical significance, and why shouldn't it have been followed up on? Can you imagine that before Air Force One touched down at Andrews Air Force Base, there were already accusations that Lyndon Johnson was involved in killing President John F. Kennedy? And can you also imagine that during that flight, Johnson, or somebody who was reporting to him, was trying to find out where the key piece of evidence, the limo, was in the air, where C-130 cargo was. And even more importantly, they were working on what to do with Kennedy's body. We'll learn about that in the upcoming segments. See you soon.